Well, thank you for joining me in this great story, which I hope will encourage you and inspire you in your own lives and ministries. I simply cannot imagine what it would have been like to have been alongside a figure like George Whitefield. But I'm going to take us in a very slightly different direction just for one of these talks, to look at one of the other great pioneers. And I've called this talk A Pioneer in the Hills, William Grimshaw of Howarth. The story of the revival is one of dynamic intensity of spiritual experience, idiosyncratic individuals, innovation, conflict, and the remarkably unexplained. The characters and stories of the Wesleys and Whitefield shine through, but they were not alone. These early pioneers in the 1740s onwards played a crucial role in bringing the revival to various parts of the country. There's a whole list of better and lesser known figures, but I have chosen just to give you one example, the extraordinary, inspiring story of William Grimshaw. Now, the parish of Howarth, set among the rugged hills and steep valleys of Yorkshire, is a mere 10 miles from the city of Bradford. William Grimshaw, born in September 1708, was the minister of Howarth from 1742 until his death in 1763. He formed deep and lasting friendships with both the Wesleys and with George Whitefield, all of whom preached regularly in Howarth. Grimshaw showed a distinct ability to rise above the theological disputes that divided the two better-known evangelists. He was, in fact, Wesley's nominated successor and named as such by Wesley's conference. He itinerated, travelled from place to place with the message of the gospel, though sought to remain generally within the expectations of the established church. He was a hero to some and Mad Grimshaw to others. Grimshaw generated opposition from clergy, negotiated his way around archbishops, and suffered immense personal tragedy during his ministry, with the successive death of 2 wives and 1 daughter. His greatest concern was for the spiritual welfare of those in his care, and he was much at home speaking to a small group gathered in a cottage, as he was standing alongside Whitefield preaching to thousands in the churchyard. Henry Venn, who was another of the great evangelical pioneers who preached in the Huddersfield area of Yorkshire and then latterly in Cambridgeshire, preached Grimshaw's funeral sermon, and he recorded his impact and the genuine hardship he faced. "Witness, ye moors and mountains, how often he was in perils by the way, whilst carrying the glad tidings of salvation to some company of poor cottagers. In this work no roads were too dangerous, no refreshment too coarse, no lodging too hard, no discouragement too great." Let me tell you the story of William Grimshaw. Well, Grimshaw had little religious influence in his upbringing. He entered Cambridge in 1726, graduated in 1730, but with little academic distinction, and completely unshaken and unmoved by matters such as faith or lifestyle. And then, in the classic fashion of the times, he sought appointment as a curate. You may remember from an earlier talk, I explained that ordination was a common career path with minimal requirements of spiritual vitality. 1735, he married Sarah Sutcliffe, a widow 2 years his junior. Grimshaw went through various periods of seriousness, seeking God with earnestness. Having been ordained, he did realise that there were certain responsibilities of the office, and he resolved he needed to try to know God better. Does this sound like a familiar journey, a familiar story, a familiar quest? So he went through these various periods of earnestness and seriousness, but lacking that assurance of salvation. Well, no details are known of the tragic illness which befell Sarah, but on the 1st of November 1739, at the age of just 29, she died, leaving her husband, curate of Todmorden in the Pennines, with 2 children under 5 years of age. Grimshaw was just 31 years of age. Inevitably, he faced many troughs, depressions, and internal conflicts. 1741, he married again, but this time his bride Elizabeth showed little sympathy for his spiritual work. How hard that must have been. Seeking fresh pastures for his new family, Grimshaw applied for the appointment of Minister of Howarth in the spring of 1742. Perhaps as a sign of things to come, the appointment was not straightforward. There were a number of rows with the bishop. The right of appointment rested with some clergy who were not over keen on Grimshaw, shall we say. The payment for the post came from the rents of a number of farms, the trustees of which were much keener on Grimshaw. In the end, Grimshaw was appointed. Grimshaw's spiritual state was confused. He sought to be a faithful minister, orthodox in belief, taking seriously the nature of the office which he occupied. He was, however, continually buffeted by doubt, temptation, and emotional turmoil. He lacked that assurance of faith that came and comes with evangelical conversion. Grimshaw, however, was slowly coming into contact with other early preachers of the revival. 1743, he met Benjamin Ingham, who had been a member of Wesley's Holy Club and was a prominent preacher in Yorkshire. And then in 1744, he came into contact with William Darnay, a revivalist preacher known as Scotch Will. Grimshaw was rather sceptical to begin with, but decided he'd better go along to hear Darnay preach and judge on the basis of the individual's own words. Recognising the message as consistent with his own beliefs, the pair struck up an unlikely friendship. Then in 1744, Grimshaw experienced what he later described as a wonderful manifestation of thyself unto me. The story was subsequently retold by John Newton, who had visited Howarth and obtained various details from Grimshaw's maid. The servant reported that on the Sunday in question, she had found her master at prayer as early as 5 a.m. Apparently, having not eaten anything, Grimshaw collapsed at the reading desk during the conduct of the morning service. He was then escorted to the local inn near to the church, dizzy, disorientated, and, under some apprehension that this seizure might issue in death, he all the way through the church and the churchyard to the clerk's house very earnestly exhorted the people to prepare to die, to be always ready to fly to Christ, and to abide in him, to trust in him only for salvation. Can you just imagine it? He's collapsed in the church. He's being carried out. He thinks death will come, and he's exhorting any who will listen to come to Christ. What a man. His limbs were icy cold and in a trance-like state for an hour. Now, he reported that he had thought he were in a dark, foul passage into which he must go, and being entered, saw on the right hand a great high wall, on the other side which was heaven, and on the left, on the other side, which was hell. He overheard God the Father holding a conference with the Lord Jesus Christ concerning him, and for a long time it seemed to go very hard with him. For God the Father would have him to be doomed, because he had not wholly relinquished his own righteousness to trust solely and entirely in the merits and righteousness of Christ. But the Lord Jesus pleaded for him. Jesus then, in this vision, made himself known to Grimshaw, who observed his wounds and his blood. Grimshaw was instantly filled with joy. He began the next church service at 2 p.m, not dismissing the congregation until 7 p.m. Grimshaw was transformed. So let me tell you now the story of his ministry. Because Howarth presented spiritual challenges from the beginning. Life was tough, and the spiritual input received over the years, to be honest, modest at best. Funerals often descended into drunkenness. The Sunday market in Bradford was infinitely more attractive than the pulpit of the parish church. And Sunday sport involved football on the moors. Never fall into this mistake of thinking contemporary debates about Sunday shopping and Sunday sports affecting our families are only relevant for today. These were the exact issues that Grimshaw faced. The people wanted to go shopping in Bradford or play football up on the moors. This was the situation he faced. But he had high expectations of his parishioners' attendance at divine service. He strolled across the moors to track down the footballers. He once disguised himself in order to join some local youthful revellers in a well-known meeting place. And when he was finally recognised, the local youths fled in a panic. On another occasion, he shamed a parishioner's miserly attitude towards those in need by dressing as a beggar and appearing at their door. And when being dismissed and told to go away, revealed who he was. There are numerous other stories, some of which no doubt are apocryphal. John Newton reported that Grimshaw frequently left the church during the singing of the psalm before the sermon to round up idlers in the churchyard and revellers at the inn. However, the suggestion that it was the 176 verses of Psalm 119 which were sung and that he used a horsewhip may well be an embellishment. But the point is, you can see this spiritual passion that has gripped Grimshaw. It drove him in unusual ways and directions. In the context of the revival, they were at least more explainable. Well, Grimshaw's methods were classic Methodist. He formed classes and small groups, and as time went on, he made use of lay assistants. In a 1747 letter to John Wesley, Grimshaw reported his practice of monthly visitation. That is, of gathering 8 to 10 families together in dwelling places scattered around his parish for teaching and exhortation. I mean, it's not a bad model, is it? In 1747, he reported to Archbishop Hutton that on his arrival in Howarth in 1742, there were 12 communicants. In 1743, 1 year after his institution, Grimshaw reported there were 326 families, 2 services each Sunday, 5 communions per year, at which there were around 50 to 60 communicants. Already some considerable growth. The significance of Grimshaw's ministry, however, really emerges after his conversion experience in 1744. As we've noted, an early and significant characteristic of the Methodists, remembering here the Methodists is the revival movement, not the denomination, significant feature, characteristic was itinerancy. Within the Church of England, where most, but not all, of the early pioneers operated, this was frowned upon at best and thoroughly opposed by some clergy. In fact, one might say thoroughly opposed by many clergy. The Church of England was built upon its parish system, and the geographical boundaries of the structure were policed by the local clergy. In theory, the arrangement provided for ministry to each and every parish. The question which the early evangelicals faced, as indeed we face today, was what to do if the gospel of the new birth was not being proclaimed from the pulpit of the parish church. Well, by 1746, the effects of the ministry in Howarth were beginning to be felt in neighbouring parishes. Many flocked to the parish to hear Grimshaw, and so the invitations came to preach elsewhere, often in private homes or barns. And of course this provoked the ire of the parish clergy concerned. The same year brought more personal tragedy, with his second wife Elizabeth dying from a fever. I don't know what evidence Charles Wesley had for this, but Charles Wesley noted in his journal that she had opposed her husband's spiritual work, but lately was convinced. In January 1747, Grimshaw entertained Charles Wesley to Howarth, and from that point onwards, he opened his pulpit to both of the Wesleys and to George Whitefield and to other evangelical leaders. The work quickly expanded, as did the workload. Grimshaw wrote to Wesley pleading for assistance. However, as we have noted, Grimshaw's work and ministry provoked a great deal of opposition, and neighbouring clergy brought charges against Grimshaw. And Grimshaw told Archbishop Hutton in May 1747 that the numbers had risen from 12, which we've mentioned before, when he arrived, now in 1748, now to 400 to 500 and nearly 1,200 in the summer. Hutton, classic Archbishop fashion, realising where the real sort of power of the gospel was, declared he could find no fault with him. And from that point on, Grimshaw began to itinerate regularly on what became known as the Great Howarth Round. Writing to Wesley, he described his itinerary over the course of 5 days, from Chester to the Pennine villages to Sheffield visiting societies, as well as on occasion being welcomed by sympathetic clergy. These circuits were all designed so that Grimshaw should return to his own parish for Sundays, so as not to neglect his own parishioners. After John Wesley's first visit to Howarth, Grimshaw wrote to him and declared that, "My pulpit, I hope, shall be always at yours and your brother's service, and my house, so long as I have one, your welcome home." In May 1747, Wesley recorded in his journal that he had read prayers and preached in Howarth Church to a numerous congregation. Wesley visited again in August 1748, followed by George Whitefield's first visit. Whitefield, back and forth, of course, across the Atlantic to the American colonies, had landed from America in July 1748 and then visited Howarth in the September. Well, part of Whitefield's journal has been lost, but an early biographer quoted from it, noting, "In the parish church, where this venerable apostle constantly laboured, I administered the Lord's Supper to upwards of 1,000 communicants, and preached in the churchyard to 6,000 hearers," numbers confirmed by Whitefield's extant correspondence. Whitefield was back in 1749 and 1750, the pattern the same, preaching in the church, administering the sacrament, and then addressing the thousands in the churchyard. Whitefield visited again in 1752. "Thousands upon thousands have flocked, twice and thrice a day, to hear the word of life." The visits continued year in, year out, with Whitefield and both Wesleys. Now, the problem of preaching to thousands of people remained, and in 1756 a more expedient method was found: a scaffolding pulpit, which would enable the preacher to pass through a window from the inside of the church onto a scaffold platform on the outside, and so preach to the crowds. Remember, the windows of these churches would not contain glass at this time, and so Whitefield, or Wesley, whoever it may be, would conduct morning service in the church, climb steps to the window, pass through the window onto a platform where the overflow congregation was waiting, and then he would preach again to the congregation in the churchyard. Whitefield was the first to use this scaffold in 1756. John Wesley reported on the 12th of July 1761, "The church would not near contain the people. However, Mr. Grimshaw had provided for this by fixing a scaffold on the outside of one of the windows, through which I went after prayers, and the people likewise all sent out into the churchyard. The afternoon congregation was larger still. What has God wrought in the midst of these rough mountains? Well, Grimshaw was a tough northerner. He dealt with the reality of people's lives, not least their spiritual destiny. Indeed, he was so focused upon the idea of eternal salvation and urgency of the message, he was more than capable of rebuking his guest speakers. John Newton records that on one occasion, Grimshaw interrupted George Whitefield in the pulpit. Can you just imagine that? Can you imagine George Whitefield in full flow in the pulpit and standing up to interrupt him? But Grimshaw interrupted George Whitefield in the pulpit because Whitefield was spending rather too long going on about and commenting on the privileges that they enjoyed in Howarth under the ministry of Mr. Grimshaw. Grimshaw interrupted. "For God's sake, do not speak so. I pray you do not flatter them. The greater part of them are going to hell with their eyes open." Well, I rather like Mr. Grimshaw, just as I rather like Mr. Whitefield. We could do, could we not, with a few more Grimshaws and a few more Whitefields today. Well, all this took its toll on Grimshaw's health. He wrote, "Oh, that we may spend and be spent in preaching his everlasting gospel, in converting sinners and confirming believers." Grimshaw was 54 years old when he died. His health had deteriorated rapidly, and fever and epidemic were ever-present realities in Howarth. One such epidemic of fever broke out in Howarth in early 1763. Already weak, he insisted on visiting the sick. Note, he didn't close his church down. He insisted on visiting the sick and proclaiming the word of God. Perhaps it was inevitable that he would fall ill with the fever, which he did around the 20th of March. He made his will and his funeral arrangements. By the 7th of April, he was dead. Now, revival has often fared best in frontier situations. In England, this was seen in the flourishing of Methodism, in the Pennines, and in Cornwall. Think also of Wales and the frontier situations in Wales. Grimshaw was certainly a pioneer. Like Whitefield, he was a moderate Calvinist, believing in God's predestination of those he would save, rather than Wesley's emphasis on free will. Like Whitefield, he rejected the Wesleyan doctrine of the possibility of Christian perfection. However, driven by his pioneering ministry and by the preaching of the new birth, he remained the closest of friends with John and Charles Wesley and George Whitefield, who were often in some degree of dispute. Grimshaw's moderate adoption of extraordinary measures, his cooperation across denominational lines, his adherence to the established church, and his unity of purpose and friendship with the Wesleys and with George Whitefield are a mark of his significant place and contribution. Thank God for William Grimshaw of Howarth.